15 years ago, Mason Calder was nothing more than a poor single father who spotted a homeless girl shivering under the awning of a bus station and decided to take her home. He gave her his last name, gave her a bed, and gave her a reason to believe the world still held decent people. 15 years later, that same man was dragged into a courtroom, branded a fraud, and told he was about to lose a $900 million empire. But when the doors of the courtroom finally swung open, the little girl from that rainy night walked in, wearing a lawyer's suit. If stories of quiet loyalty and breathless courtroom reversals are what you love, press subscribe now and stay with us for the tale that comes next. The rain came down hard over Baltimore that night, the kind of cold spring downpour that turned the harbor into a sheet of hammered iron. Mason Calder had just finished a double shift at the port, and the smell of engine oil and sea salt still clung to his jacket like a second skin. He was 31 then, a widower with grease permanently worked into the creases of his knuckles, and he wanted nothing more than to buy a little food and get home to his son, Graham, who was waiting up past his bedtime the way he always did. Mason walked past the old bus depot with his collar turned up against the wind, his mind already halfway to the small apartment where a boy would run to the door the moment he heard the key. That was when he saw her. A girl, maybe 9 years old, sat curled beneath the depot's cracked awning with her knees pulled to her chest and a torn backpack clutched against her body like the last thing she owned in the world. Her hair was soaked through, her shoes had holes at the toes, and she watched the passing strangers with the guarded stillness of a child who had learned that hoping for help usually cost more than it gave. No one had come for her. No one seemed to be looking. Mason slowed his steps, and something in his chest that had gone quiet since his wife's death began, against his will, to stir awake. He did not act on impulse, because impulse was a luxury poor men could rarely afford. Mason knew that a grown man approaching a lost child in the dark could frighten her worse than the cold. So he kept his distance, crouched a few paces away, and asked her name in the same low voice he used to calm his own son from a nightmare. She told him her name was Willa Brooks, and nothing more. He called the local police from the payphone across the street, and he asked them to send someone from Child Services, because he wanted every part of this done the right way, in the light, with nothing hidden. But he did not leave. He bought a carton of warm milk from the all-night counter and a cheap coat from the 24-hour shop on the corner, and he set them both beside her without a word. She did not thank him, not at first. She only studied the coat and the milk as though they might be a trick, and after a long moment she asked him a single question that would stay lodged in his heart for the rest of his life. She asked, "Are you coming back?" Mason went still. He knew that question. He had heard it in his own son's voice on the nights he worked late, and he had felt its weight in his own chest as a boy, waiting on a porch for a father who never returned. He looked at this soaked, wary, motherless child and understood that she was not asking about tonight. She was asking whether anyone in the entire world would choose to keep her. The months that followed were made of paperwork and patience. Mason submitted to the interviews and the home visits and the endless forms, and slowly he became her legal guardian, and then, in a small county office with fluorescent lights and a tired clerk, her father. He was not rich when he did it. He was not powerful, and he had nothing to prove to anyone watching, because no one was watching. He took Willa in for the plainest reason a person can have, which was simple kindness offered at a moment when he himself could barely keep his own head above water. On the day the adoption was finalized, he placed a house key into her small palm and folded her fingers over it, and he told her something she would carry for 15 years. He said, "In this house, nobody gets left out in the rain." That sentence became the promise at the center of everything that came after. Time moved the way it always does, faster than anyone expects. Mason kept his job at the port by day, repairing tractor units and stubborn diesel engines, and by night, at the kitchen table under a lamp with a bent shade, he taught himself the business of freight. He noticed what the men in suits never bothered to see, that the whole industry bled money from 1,000 small wounds. Trucks ran empty on their return trips. Cold storage sat idle, waiting on orders that arrived too late. Containers hung frozen at the docks for days at a time, simply because the big companies guarded their data like misers and refused to coordinate. Mason had spent his whole life inside those wounds, and he began to imagine, engine by engine and route by route, how a man might stitch them closed. From a cramped garage with a leaking roof, he founded Calder Harbor Services with 3 second-hand trucks and a crude dispatch program that Graham and Willa helped him refine once they were old enough to sit at the keyboard. What Mason had that the others lacked could not be bought at any price. He understood the workers, he understood the drivers, the mechanics, the longshoremen who moved the freight with their own backs, because he had been every one of them. He did not build his company from a boardroom. He built it out of mud and sweat, and the plain honor of keeping a delivery time he had promised. And word spread among the men who mattered that Calder was a name you could trust. Willa grew up inside that world, and she absorbed from her adoptive father a patience and a self-respect that no school could teach. She was never a fragile creature in the corner. She appeared in the story of those years as a series of small, bright cuts. A teenage girl standing in the oily light of the garage reading a battered book of contract law, listening while Mason explained the fine print of a shipping agreement, asking him why it was that poor people always seemed to lose the moment they failed to understand the paperwork. Mason had no easy answer, but he gave her the truest one he had. He told her, "In this life you might not have money, but never once sign a thing you have not read to the very last word." That single sentence planted a seed that would one day grow into everything. Willa decided she would study law, and when the tuition bills came due, Mason sold the very first truck he had ever bought to cover them, even though the company badly needed the cash that season. Graham, who was older now and had begun to think of the girl as a true sister, stood with his father and said that if Willa wanted to become a lawyer, then the whole family would carry that dream together. Over 15 years, Calder Harbor Services swelled into Calder Harbor and Rail, a logistics empire worth nearly $900 million, with dry ports and cold chain warehouses and a private rail line threading across state borders. But the larger the company became, the more strangers Mason was forced to seat around his boardroom table. And that, though he did not yet know it, was where the danger began. In the present day, Mason Calder was no longer a broke mechanic with grease under his nails. He was the founder of an empire that owned dry ports, refrigerated warehouses, a private railway, and federal shipping contracts that moved goods across the whole eastern seaboard. And yet he still wore the same worn canvas jacket he had worn at the docks, still laced up steel-toed work boots every morning, and still took his lunch sitting on an overturned crate beside the drivers rather than in any glass-walled dining room. To the men who moved the freight, that simplicity made him a king worth following. To the board of directors, it made him a relic. Barton Kingsley, the chairman of that board, had decided that a man who ate lunch with truckers was no longer fit to steer a corporation approaching $1 billion in value. He was a polished creature of committees and quiet lunches, and he had come to see Mason's plain habits as a weakness to be exploited rather than a virtue to be honored. Kingsley formed a private alliance with Priscilla Van Dorn, the chief executive of Van Dorn Equity, a woman who came from old financial blood and wore her ambition the way other people wore perfume. Together they devised a plan to force Mason to surrender his controlling shares at a fraction of their worth, and then to swallow the whole empire he had built from 3 rusted trucks. Their scheme was patient and precise. Kingsley engineered a lawsuit built around an old military freight contract, and he accused Mason of using company assets to fund a private trust for his family, and most pointedly for Willa, the adopted daughter who shared none of his blood. The goal was to convince a court to freeze Mason's voting rights, to pry him loose from the founder's chair, and then to sell the crippled company straight into the arms of Van Dorn Equity. It was elegant, and it was cruel, and it was designed to make Mason's greatest act of decency look like the mechanism of a fraud. What blindsided Mason was that the documents his enemies produced all bore a signature that looked exactly like his own. The trust account that had been created in Willa's name was twisted and reframed as evidence that he had been quietly bleeding the company dry to enrich a girl he had picked up off the street. The story leaked, and soon the very people who had once praised his rise began to call him a hypocrite, a sentimental fraud who wrapped his greed in the language of charity. Graham burned to strike back at once, to march into the press and tear the accusations apart. But Mason held him still with a hand on his shoulder and the calm of a man who had survived worse storms. He believed the truth had its own current, and that if he refused to panic, it would find its way to the surface in time. Still, the thing that wounded him was not the threat to his fortune. He had been poor before and knew he could survive being poor again. What cut him to the bone was the way they used Willa's past, the way they held up the single most human act of his life and called it a weakness, a sentimental mistake that a serious man would never have made. They spoke of the frightened girl under the awning as though she were a liability on a balance sheet, and they suggested that his love for her had rotted his judgment. On the final evening before it all came to a head, a courier arrived at Mason's door with a summons, and the notice made the timeline brutally clear. In 72 hours, a hearing would decide the fate of everything he had built. When the crisis broke open, everyone who loved Mason went looking for Willa. She had grown into a young attorney based in Washington, specializing in the tangled worlds of trust law and corporate fraud, precisely the fields that now threatened to consume her father. She was, by any measure, the one person alive most equipped to defend him. But at the exact hour Mason needed her most, Willa did not answer her phone. Her office said only that she was away. Her apartment sat dark. The messages went unreturned, and the silence stretched out like a held breath. That silence bred suspicion, and suspicion is a hungry thing. Had Willa turned her back on the man who raised her, choosing her career over the father whose name she carried? Had Van Dorn's money reached her first and bought her allegiance? Or was she hiding some secret of her own, some truth too dangerous to speak aloud? Barton Kingsley seized upon her absence like a gift and fed it to the press with a smooth and knowing sorrow. He told anyone who would listen that even Mason Calder's own adopted daughter would not stand up to defend him, and surely that told the world something rotten lived inside the Calder family. Priscilla Van Dorn, in a chilly interview delivered from a marble lobby, remarked that an empire could never be run on pity, and that sentiment had finally caught up with a foolish old man. Mason did not blame Willa. In the quiet of his study, he lifted an old photograph from his desk, a faded picture from a rainy night at a bus depot, and in it a small girl wore the cheap coat he had bought for her and stood beside a young Graham, smiling so faintly you had to know her to see it. He held the photograph a long time. Then he said to June Holloway, the loyal legal secretary who had stood by him for years, that Willa owed him nothing at all. He had not taken her in so that one day she would repay the debt. He had taken her in because a child was cold, and no arithmetic of gratitude had ever entered into it. That refusal to treat love as a loan made Mason larger in that dark hour, not smaller. What no one in Baltimore knew was that Willa had not vanished out of fear or betrayal. She was hundreds of miles away, moving through the dim back rooms of an old law office, hunting for the original of a trust document that June Holloway had once been entrusted to keep safe. And in the course of that search, she had discovered something that changed the entire shape of the accusation. The fund standing in her name was not money that Mason had siphoned out of the company at all. It was a founder's protective trust, established long before Calder Harbor and Rail ever went public, built for the express purpose of shielding the company's founding principles from exactly the kind of predators now circling it. Late on the second night, in a records vault thick with dust and the smell of old paper, Willa found what she had come for. It was a sealed archival box, its edges frayed with age, and across the front in Mason's own careful hand were written words she read 3 times before she trusted them. The box was labeled, "For Willa Brooks Calder, when the court finally asks who owns the promise." She sat down on the cold floor with the box in her lap, and for the first time in 15 years, the frightened girl and the sharp young lawyer became the same person again. The hearing convened in the federal commercial court on a gray morning, and the air inside the chamber was formal and cold and heavy with pressure. Mason sat at the defense table beside a temporary attorney who had inherited a case he did not fully understand, while across the aisle Barton Kingsley commanded an expensive phalanx of lawyers led by the notorious Elliot Wainford, a man who had built his career on strangling opponents with the very contracts they had signed. Judge Margaret Ellison presided, a stern and famously unbribable jurist who had thrown wealthier men than Kingsley out of her courtroom, and she asked both sides to make their positions plain. The question before her was whether Mason Calder had abused company assets to build a private fund, and whether his voting rights ought to be suspended while the matter was resolved. Elliot Wainford opened with the confidence of a man holding a winning hand. He put the wire transfers on the screen, then the trust agreements, then Mason's signature enlarged until it filled the wall, and finally, deliberately, the adoption papers themselves. He painted a portrait for the court, a sentimental single father who had brought a homeless girl into his home, and then, blinded by affection, had quietly funneled the company's assets into her keeping. It was a masterful and poisonous performance, because it did not merely attack Mason's finances. It attacked his dignity, and it took the kindest thing the man had ever done and reforged it into the weapon aimed at his heart. Wainford turned to Mason and asked him directly, in front of the packed gallery, whether he had adopted a girl named Willa Brooks. Mason answered that he had. Wainford asked whether he had established a fund bearing her name. Mason answered again that he had. A murmur ran through the chamber like a current, and outside the courtroom the story flashed instantly across every wire that the founder had confessed to moving assets to his adopted child. Barton Kingsley allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Priscilla Van Dorn sat in the rear gallery with the serene stillness of a woman who had already read the last page of the book. Mason's borrowed lawyer rose to explain that the trust was entirely lawful, that it had been created for legitimate purposes, but without the original terms in hand his words rang thin and defensive, and the judge's expression did not soften. The momentum in the room had shifted hard against the defense, and the machinery of the law began, slowly and inexorably, to move toward freezing Mason's control of his own company. Judge Ellison lifted her eyes from her papers and asked the question that would decide everything. She asked whether the defense had any further witnesses or documents to present. Mason's attorney fell silent. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom stayed shut. Willa had not come. And then, in the exact moment the judge lifted her pen to sign a preliminary order, those doors swung open. A young woman in a dark tailored suit walked in with an old leather portfolio under her arm, and she did not hurry, and she did not look frightened, and she offered no flustered apology for the interruption. She walked straight to the clerk's table with the steady stride of someone who had rehearsed this entrance in her mind 100 times, and she said in a clear and even voice, "Willa Brooks Calder, counsel of record for the defense. I move to submit emergency evidence." The whole chamber went silent. Mason turned in his chair and looked at her, and for one suspended moment he did not see an attorney at all. He saw a soaked 9-year-old under a bus depot awning, asking whether anyone would ever come back for her. But Willa did not let the emotion of that gaze weaken her. She stood straight, her chin level, her voice steady and professional, and she waited for the court to acknowledge her the way any officer of the law would wait. Whatever storm of feeling moved beneath her calm surface, she had locked it away behind 15 years of the patience her father had taught her. Elliot Wainford was on his feet at once, objecting that Willa Brooks Calder carried an obvious conflict of interest, being the adopted daughter of the very defendant whose fortune was at stake. Willa answered him without a flicker of heat. She replied that since the plaintiffs had chosen to make her identity and her adoption the very centerpiece of their accusations, she had every right to appear both as a witness to the truth of that trust and as supporting counsel on the matter of its terms. The logic was clean, and it turned Wainford's own strategy against him, and Judge Ellison, after a long and measured look at both of them, permitted Willa to present a preliminary statement. Willa opened the leather portfolio and drew out the original of the Calder Founders Trust, the document that had been created years before the company ever grew into a corporation. She laid it before the court, and she walked the judge through its plain language, and that language proved something no one on the plaintiff's side wanted proven. Mason had not moved company assets into the hands of his adopted daughter. He had done the opposite. He had placed a portion of his founding shares into a protective trust for the express purpose of stopping the board from ever selling the company in violation of the principles on which it had been built. The fund was not a theft, it was a wall. That was the first reversal, and it landed hard. Willa Brooks Calder was not the secret recipient of stolen money. She was the appointed guardian of the founding shares, the person Mason had chosen to protect the heart of the company in the event that he was ever driven from it by fraud. The girl the plaintiffs had held up as proof of Mason's corruption was, by the plain terms of his own document, the one safeguard he had built against exactly the kind of corruption now surrounding him. Willa turned then and looked across the aisle at Barton Kingsley, and she spoke without raising her voice. She said, "The question was never what my father took out of this company. The question is who is trying to sell what was never theirs to sell." Willa moved to her second piece of evidence, and it was one that Elliot Wainford could not resist mocking. She produced a letter, handwritten by Mason on the day her adoption was finalized, and Wainford scoffed openly that a sentimental family note carried no weight in a court of law. But Willa was ready for the sneer. She demonstrated that this letter had not been kept in a drawer as a keepsake. It had been formally attached to the trust documents as the founders' declared statement of intent, incorporated by reference into the legal instrument itself, and therefore it spoke with the force of the trust that contained it. She read from it, and the courtroom grew very still. In the letter, Mason had written that he had lost his family once and would not stand by while anyone was left behind, simply because they lacked a great name or a fortune. He had written that he was not establishing the trust to make Willa wealthy, but to protect the company from the sort of men who would one day try to turn it into a machine for their own speculation. And he had written a line that now seemed to reach forward across the years and touch the very room they sat in. He had written that if the board ever used Willa's past as a weapon against the Calder family, that act itself would be the proof that they had betrayed the founding spirit of the company, and the trust's protections were to activate the moment such a betrayal occurred. The chamber was silent, in a different way now, the silence of people who have watched a trap spring shut but cannot yet tell who stands inside it. The letter was not merely moving, it was load-bearing. It connected directly to a specific clause buried in the founders' trust, a clause that stated plainly that if the board sought to sell controlling shares to a third party by manufacturing a false accusation against the founder, then a reserve voting authority would pass to the guardian of the trust. And the guardian of the trust, named in the document years ago, was Willa. Elliot Wainford objected furiously that the clause had long since expired, that whatever protection it once offered had lapsed with time. Willa answered by producing the annual renewal filings, each one submitted precisely on schedule, every single year, by June Holloway. June Holloway was called to the stand, and the old secretary took her oath with the quiet firmness of a woman who had waited a long time to tell the truth. She confirmed that Mason had always kept the trust transparent, that he had reported it fully and filed its renewals without fail. And then she confirmed the thing that turned the whole gallery cold. Barton Kingsley had deliberately hidden those reports from the rest of the board, burying the very documents that would have proven the trust was legitimate, so that when his manufactured lawsuit arrived, no director would remember that Mason had done everything in the open. Across the aisle, Priscilla Van Dorn's composure finally cracked at the edges because she understood, before anyone else in the room, that if this clause was recognized as valid, her entire acquisition would collapse into dust. Mason watched Willa work, and the pride in his chest was almost more than he could hold, though he held it, because that too was something he had taught her. She had not merely come to defend him. She had come carrying everything he had ever tried to give her, the habit of reading a document to its final word, the refusal to break a promise, and the plain iron conviction that powerful people did not get to rewrite the truth simply because they could afford better lawyers than the men they trampled. The child he had sheltered from one storm had grown into the woman now sheltering him from another, and the symmetry of it sat heavy and sweet in his throat. Then Willa stopped defending and began to attack. She was no longer only shielding her father. She set out to prove that the plaintiffs had built the entire lawsuit as an instrument to steal the company outright. She presented a chain of internal messages that passed between Barton Kingsley and Priscilla Van Dorn, and in them the two conspirators spoke with the careless cruelty of people who believed no one would ever read their words aloud. Kingsley had agreed to apply legal pressure in order to drive down the price of Calder Harbor and Rail before Van Dorn Equity made its formal offer to buy. They referred to Mason as the old mechanic with a family weakness, and they referred to Willa herself as the emotional card that could be flipped into a financial accusation. Those words struck Mason like a physical blow, but they also stripped the last mask from the men and women arrayed against him, and the whole courtroom saw at last the coldness beneath the tailored suits. Elliot Wainford scrambled to argue that the messages had been altered, spliced together out of context to deceive the court. Willa was waiting for exactly that objection. She entered the metadata, the digital signatures, and the certification of an independent forensic examiner who had verified every line, because she had known from the beginning that her opponents would never concede an inch without a fight, and she had built her case in patient, overlapping layers that could not be pulled apart. Then she delivered the blow beneath the blow. Willa produced records of a payment routed from a shell company controlled by Van Dorn Equity into a consulting account belonging to Barton Kingsley. The transfer had been labeled, with almost laughable arrogance, as a strategic advisory fee. But the date of that payment fell on the very same day Kingsley had filed his lawsuit against Mason, and no jury and no judge in the world could believe that timing to be a coincidence. Judge Ellison turned to Kingsley and demanded, in a voice gone flat and dangerous, that he explain the payment. For the first time in the entire proceeding, Barton Kingsley faltered, and the smooth patrician confidence drained out of his face, and he had no answer that would not condemn him. The larger reversal came when Willa produced the minutes of a private meeting, sealed records in which Kingsley had promised Van Dorn that if Mason's voting rights could be frozen, the board would sell 51% of Calder Harbor and Rail at a price 40% below its true value. That single fact detonated in the chamber because it revealed that the scheme would not merely rob Mason. It would gut every shareholder, betray every employee, and hand thousands of working families to a buyer who intended to strip the company for parts. Judge Ellison's demeanor shifted visibly toward the defense, and she ordered an immediate halt to any and all transactions involving Van Dorn equity until the full body of evidence could be examined. Willa faced the gallery and said, "They called my father a man who exploited family sentiment. But it is they who plan to sell thousands of working families into silence, just to turn a quiet profit." Priscilla Van Dorn was not a woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and she rose now to fight with the only weapon she had left. She directed her counsel to open a line of questioning aimed squarely at Willa's identity, hoping to shake the young lawyer's credibility and poison her testimony in the eyes of the court. It was a calculated cruelty, an attempt to make Willa's own history the thing that discredited her, and for a moment the temperature in the room dropped as everyone braced for what was coming. Elliot Wainford led Willa back through the wounds of her childhood one by one. He asked about the nights she had spent homeless, about the fact that she had never known her birth parents, about the tuition Mason had paid to send her through law school. His purpose was transparent. He wanted to cast her as a woman so buried in gratitude that she could not possibly be objective, a debtor testifying to protect the man who owned her loyalty. The pressure grew thick and suffocating, and every eye in the gallery turned toward the young attorney to see whether she would crack. Willa did not crack. She stood perfectly still and let the silence work for her instead of against her. She admitted all of it, freely and without shame. She said that Mason had given her a home, a name, an education, and a life, and that she would never pretend otherwise. But then she turned the confession into her sharpest argument. She said that precisely because Mason had given her those things, she understood better than anyone alive the difference between a debt and a promise. A debt is something you repay to be free of it. A promise is something you keep because of who you have chosen to be. She had not come to that courtroom to repay a debt with emotion. She had come because the documents in her hands proved the truth, and the truth needed no gratitude to make it real. Then Willa unveiled the piece of evidence no one had seen coming. Priscilla Van Dorn, she revealed, had attempted to reach her before the hearing ever began. Through an intermediary, Van Dorn had offered Willa a partnership position at a prestigious firm in New York, along with a substantial sum of money, on one condition that she simply fail to appear in court. Willa had recorded the entire meeting, lawfully and completely, in full accordance with the recording statutes of the state where the conversation took place, because the instinct her father had planted in her had told her to protect the truth before she ever tried to use it. The recording was played aloud in the chamber, and the intermediary's voice rang out with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The voice said, "Van Dorn Equity does not need you to betray your father. We only need you to stay silent." Those words did more damage than any document had, because they exposed the true shape of the plot. The conspirators had never required Willa's treachery. They had only required her absence. Silence itself was the instrument by which they meant to steal the company, and now that silence had been broken open for the whole court to hear. Mason looked at Willa with an expression that held both fierce pride and a father's aching sorrow. He understood at last what those days of her disappearance had truly cost her, the weight she had carried alone, the enemy she had walked directly behind in order to gather the final proof. She had not abandoned him. She had gone quiet on purpose, slipping past the defenses of powerful people who would have crushed her the moment they saw her coming, and she had done it without a word to the man she was protecting. Judge Ellison ordered the recording entered into the record, and she issued a stern warning to the plaintiffs regarding the clear signs of witness interference, and the gallery felt the case tilt fully and finally onto its new axis. With the evidence accepted and the plot laid bare, Willa turned to the most important provision of the Calder founders' trust, the clause that Mason himself had drafted years earlier, but had prayed he would never have cause to use. She read it into the record slowly, so that no one could later claim to have misunderstood it. The clause stated that if the founder were ever attacked through a financial accusation tied to his family, and if that accusation were proven to have been manufactured in service of a hostile takeover, then the founding voting authority would pass temporarily to the trust's independent protector. And that protector, named in the document years before, was Willa Brooks Calder, effective once she had come of age and held a license to practice law. The meaning of it swept through the chamber like a change in air pressure. In the very moment Barton Kingsley chose to use Willa as the instrument to destroy Mason, he had unknowingly triggered the legal power that now resided in Willa herself. The weapon they had forged out of her past turned in their hands and became the shield that saved everything. This was the deepest reversal of the entire ordeal, the one that made the gallery gasp aloud, because the person the conspirators had dismissed as Mason's fatal weakness turned out to be the single figure holding the key to the survival of his empire. Willa moved the court to recognize her temporary voting authority, to freeze the Van Dorn acquisition in its entirety, to suspend Barton Kingsley from any role on the board, and to permit Mason to continue running the company he had founded until the investigation reached its conclusion. Elliot Wainford objected with everything he had left, his voice climbing, his arguments growing wilder. But there was no solid ground left beneath his feet, and everyone in the room could hear it. Judge Ellison examined the documents with care, compared the signatures line by line, confirmed the dates on which the trust renewals had been filed, and then declared that the court had more than sufficient grounds to issue an emergency order. The preliminary ruling came down like a hammer finding its mark. Mason's authority would not be frozen. The sale of the company was suspended at once. Barton Kingsley was removed from every decision touching Calder Harbor and Rail, and Willa Brooks Calder was formally recognized as the protector of the founding voting authority for the duration of the investigation. A wave of astonished murmuring rolled through the gallery, and Priscilla Van Dorn shot to her feet to leave, but Judge Ellison ordered her to remain, informing her coldly that she might yet be implicated in the manipulation of evidence and the obstruction of a witness. Mason bowed his head, not out of weakness, but because he knew his empire had just been saved by the very child who had once asked him whether he would ever come back. After the courtroom emptied, Mason and Willa found each other in the marble corridor outside, and there was no flood of theatrical tears between them, because they had both survived far too much to turn this moment into a performance. Mason looked at her for a long while, and finally he spoke the thing that had haunted him for days. He said, "I thought you had gone." Willa answered him with the faint, level steadiness he had watched her grow into. She said, "I learned from you. When people build a trap in front of the door, you find the way in from the back." Her answer told him everything, that she had not only been raised by him but had inherited the very shape of his mind, calm and practical and quiet, and yet relentless in its pursuit of the truth all the way to the bottom. Mason apologized then for allowing her past to be dragged into open court, for the way strangers had picked over the hardest years of her life as though they were entries in a ledger. Willa told him it was not his fault. "People like Barton and Priscilla," she said, "always assumed that a person's humble beginnings were a thing that could be used to shame them. But for Willa, her beginnings were something else entirely. They were the proof that she understood, more deeply than any of her privileged opponents ever could, the true worth of a roof, a signature, and a promise kept." Graham appeared briefly at the end of the hall and folded his adopted sister into a rough embrace, telling her simply that he had always known she would come, and the small family stood whole for a moment without any need for further words. Mason asked her why she had not told him her plan before she vanished, why she had let him suffer through those long silent days, believing he might be alone. Willa answered that if he had known, he would have spent every ounce of his strength trying to protect her, and in doing so he might have tipped off their enemies and lost the element of surprise. This time, she said, she had wanted to be the one who did the protecting. And there, in that plain corridor, the great emotional truth of the whole story finally settled into place. 15 years earlier, Mason had walked into Willa's life at the moment she had no one left in the world. 15 years later, she had walked into a courtroom at the moment he was about to lose everything. Mason looked at her, and his voice was rough when he spoke. He said, "I did not adopt you so that you would save me." And Willa answered him with the words that closed the circle they had drawn together across a decade and a half. She said, "I know, but you taught me never to let family stand alone out in the rain." They stood together in the quiet. After that, a father and a daughter bound by no blood at all, and by something that had proven, in the end, to be far stronger than blood. In the weeks that followed, Calder Harbor and Rail restructured its battered board of directors from the ground up. Barton Kingsley faced a formal investigation for fraud, for the manipulation of evidence, and for accepting payment from a company tied to Van Dorn Equity, and the polished reputation he had spent decades building crumbled in a matter of days. Priscilla Van Dorn lost her acquisition and found herself the subject of a financial inquiry that would follow her for years. Elliot Wainford quietly withdrew from the case entirely, abandoning his clients in a bid to salvage what remained of his own name, which was, in its way, the most honest thing he had done in the whole affair. Mason returned to the company, but he no longer ran it alone as he once had, because he had learned in the hardest possible way what isolation could cost a man. He appointed Graham to oversee technical operations, the domain his son had always loved best. He asked June Holloway to supervise the transparency of the company's records, so that no report would ever again be buried in the dark. And he invited Willa to serve as special legal counsel to the Founders Trust, not as a family ornament or a symbol of sentiment, but because she had proven herself the one person willing to defend the company from those who would use a contract to break a promise. Willa accepted, on the condition that she would answer to the document and to the truth, and to nothing else. Mason called a gathering of the entire company at the very same harbor pier where he had once worked as a young mechanic with grease under his nails and salt in his hair. Standing before the workers, the drivers, the engineers, and the office staff, he told them the short story of a rainy night many years before. He did not tell it to display his own kindness, and he made that plain. He told it to remind every soul standing on that pier that Calder Harbor and Rail had been built upon a single, unbreakable principle, that no person would ever be left behind merely because they lacked power or money or a great and familiar name. Willa stood beside him as he spoke, no longer the homeless child of the past, but the woman who had wielded the law itself to protect her family and the thousands of families who depended on the company for their bread. The final scene unfolded on an ordinary morning at the pier, with the water bright and the gulls wheeling overhead. Mason watched the long convoys pulling out of the yards, watched the containers rising smoothly onto the waiting ships, watched the private rail line come alive and begin its patient work of carrying the country's goods across the miles. Willa came to stand beside him, and she pressed something small and cold into his palm. It was the old house key, the very key he had once folded into her 9-year-old hand on the night she had no home at all. She had kept it for 15 years. She looked at him, and there was the ghost of a smile in her eyes. She said, "You gave me a key when I had no home. Today I am only giving you back the key to the empire you built." Mason turned the worn metal over in his fingers, and then he slipped it into the pocket of the same old canvas jacket he had worn through every season of his life, from the docks to the boardroom and back again. The $900 million empire was still his, restored and safe. But far more than that, the promise he had spoken beneath a leaking awning on a cold and rainy night The promise that in his house nobody would ever be left out in the rain remained exactly as whole and unbroken as the day he first made it.